Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we were taking a quiet journey into something both solemn and strangely tender, the world of marriage in the Middle Ages. Long before white dresses, diamond rings, and vows spoken for love alone, there was a different kind of union, part ceremony, part survival, and part sacred mystery. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what getting married truly meant when the world was lit by firelight and ruled by faith. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like the soft toll of distant bells across a fog-covered valley. Before we begin, I'd like to share something small. If you enjoyed these slow, sleepy journeys through history, consider liking the video or subscribing, only if you really enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. The air outside the village chapel is damp with mist. A thin bell swings somewhere above, echoing against the wooden beams and the thatched roofs beyond. Beneath it, two families stand in silence, not for romance, but for duty. In the 13th century, a marriage was less a meeting of hearts than an alignment of fortunes, a bridge between fields, names, and souls. The scent of beeswax candles fills the air. A priest murmurs Latin words that few understand, his breath curling into the cold. The bride's veil is simple linen, not silk, and her hands tremble not from love, but from fear. Fear of leaving her father's hearth for another man's, of bearing children she has never dreamed of a lifetime measured by seasons and harvests. Marriage, to the medieval mind, was not invented for happiness. It was a bond designed to mirror the order of God's world, hierarchy, obedience, and endurance. Yet within its structure, small sparks of tenderness lived. A shy glance over a shared loaf of bread, the rhythm of two people kneeling side by side in prayer, the quiet knowledge that survival in a world so fragile was easier with another pair of hands. When the priest lifts his hand to bless them, the congregation murmurs Amen. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows, a reminder that life continues. The ring, if there is one, is a loop of bronze or twisted iron. The words, I thee wed, are spoken not as poetry, but as promise, a contract of flesh and faith. To understand medieval marriage, you must first understand the world that created it. It was a society bound by custom, by land, and by the church's watchful eye. Love, as we think of it, was a luxury. The union of two people was meant to serve a larger order, family lineage, economic alliance, divine law. Yet even within those boundaries, affection found secret paths. Lovers wrote their names on chapel doors, sang beneath windows, or exchanged tokens carved from bone. In manors and peasant cottages alike, the rules of marriage defined every breath of life. A noble wedding might fill a hall with feasting, while a peasant's might be blessed in the open air before the village cross. But the purpose was the same, to mark two souls as joined before God and community. Without that public moment, even the most devoted pair could be deemed sinful. Picture the sound of distant bells again, not joyous but steady, solemn, ancient. They mark time as surely as they mark faith. A wedding bell was a promise that the order of things remained intact. Births would follow, fields would be tended, and sin would be held at bay. To the medieval heart, marriage was both a shield against chaos and a mirror of divine creation. When the newly joined couple steps from the chapel, they cross a threshold, not just into a new home, but into a lifetime of obligation. The villagers greet them with a shower of grain, a symbol of fertility, and rough laughter. Children tug at the bride's gown. Someone presses bread into her hand for luck. In the distance, the sky brightens with the first thin sunlight of morning. Later, at home, she will kneel by the hearth and whisper a prayer. He will hang his cloak on a wooden peg and stare at the smoke twisting up toward the rafters. In that silence, the enormity of what has happened settles between them. Two lives, once separate, now woven together like threads in a coarse wool blanket, uneven, imperfect, but warm. Outside, The world smells of earth and ash, of damp straw and faint rosemary. Inside, the candles flicker low. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a story of romance. It was a story of endurance, community, and faith. And beneath those cold church bells, it was also the story of countless quiet acts of love, unspoken, unrecorded, yet utterly human. The sound of the bell fades. Tomorrow, we'll drift deeper into that world, to learn how marriages were planned, bought, and promised long before the couple ever met. But for now, let the echoes of the vows linger in the air. The world remembers you. The story of a medieval wedding began long before the church bell rang. Sometimes it began at birth. Two families, seated by a smoky hearth, might whisper over bread and wine about futures not yet lived. A father weighed dowry against land, kinship against honor. A mother thought of her daughter's safety, her son's alliances, the tangled web that bound every name to another. Love, though faintly present, was seldom the first concern. Marriage was a negotiation, half spiritual, half survival. Picture a small parchment laid upon a rough oak table. Its ink glistens in lamplight, promises of cattle, coin, or the right to draw water from a neighboring stream. The words are few, yet they decide decades of living. For nobles, the contract sealed dynasties. For peasants, it meant the difference between hunger and harvest. A girl's hand might be pledged to a man twice her age, chosen not for affection, but for the size of his granary or the proximity of his fields. When the priest or notary arrived, the mood was hushed. Witnesses pressed their marks beside the wax seal. Outside, hands scratched among frozen stalks, oblivious to the weight of what had been agreed. The betrothal could be made when the children were still small, and broken only by death or sin. From that moment on, their lives were bound by invisible thread. She would grow up knowing the name of the man she was promised to, sometimes longing, sometimes dreading. Dowry chests were prepared with the care of altars. Within them lay linens, pewter spoons, perhaps a silver clasp, if fortune allowed. Each item spoke of worth, of virtue, of the family's standing in the eyes of neighbors. A poor father might barter goats, a merchant a share in his trade. And always, behind the arithmetic of marriage, lingered the church's stern gaze. No union could be made without its blessing, no bargain complete without its prayer. Among villagers, the process was simpler, but no less solemn. A handshake before witnesses could bind two hearts as firmly as parchment. Sometimes a token, a knife, a ring, or a strip of cloth, changed hands to seal the promise. From then on, they were as good as wed, though months or even years might pass before the priest's blessing made it official. To break such a pledge was shameful, to honor it, sacred. Evenings after such agreements carried a peculiar stillness. Fathers stared into the fire, thinking of debts now settled. Mothers folded fabrics that would one day line a daughter's chest. Somewhere, the betrothed girl watched the smoke twist upward, imagining a face she barely knew. Perhaps she whispered his name once, testing its sound in the quiet of the room. Outside, the winter wind sighed against the shutters. The old world's only witness to her thoughts. Among the highborn, betrothals became instruments of power. A single marriage could join kingdoms, end wars, or ignite them anew. Children of nobles were pawns in a long game of allegiance, sent to foreign courts to learn language and manners until they were of age. Yet even there, moments of gentleness slipped through the iron logic of politics. A shared glance at a feast, a gift of embroidered gloves, a melody learned from a foreign minstrel. The church tried to tame these worldly motives with its own laws. Cousins could not wed without papal dispensation. Secret promises made without witnesses were suspect, though they happened often. Confessors heard tales of unions formed in barns or meadows, solemnized by words alone. The heart, it seemed, resisted regulation. In the dark corners of Christendom, love still whispered its own liturgy. When a betrothal was finally announced, the village came alive with gossip. Who had gained, who had lost, who had sold too dear. Neighbors measured worth by rumor and by prayer. For the young couple, the path ahead was set. Months of preparation, of spinning cloth, of saving grain for the wedding feast. Every day carried them closer to that moment when vow would become law and bargaining would turn to blessing. As night deepens, the ink on the contract dries. The wax hardens, the candle gutters low. Outside, frost gathers on the window pane, tracing delicate patterns, fragile, impermanent, yet binding in their beauty. Tomorrow will bring new negotiations, new hopes, new fears. But for now, the house sleeps beneath the sound of distant bells, dreaming of unions not yet made. The morning after bargains are struck, the village wakes under pale light and a rim of frost. You hear the slow shuffle of clogs in the lane, the hiss of damp wood taking flame, the rustle of hens beneath their straw. A quiet breath before everything becomes official. Names will be woven to other names. Fields will learn new footsteps. A house will grow another heartbeat. In this world, lineage is a map inked on parchment and remembered in mouths. Blood remembers debts. Blood guards borders. Blood tells stories that land alone cannot hold. The air smells of peat smoke and boiled barley as elders recite who begot whom, how a cousin once rescued a harvest, why an aunt's marriage tied two valleys together. Inside the church porch, a notched staff hangs where bands are posted. Outside, flax rattles on a winter line. Kinship, though invisible, is treated like a fence you must not cross. The church counts degrees of relatedness with care. Aunt to nephew, cousin to cousin, spinning arithmetic out of ancestry. Too close, and you invite sin. Far enough, and blessing may fall like gentle rain. Scribes scratch the names, while the priest traces lines with his finger, measuring proximity the way a farmer measures furrows. Even godparents, bound by spiritual kinship, can make a match unlawful. The air tastes faintly of ink and iron. By the 13th century, law has found a new voice. At the Fourth Lateran Council, it is announced that marriages must be proclaimed publicly, bonds called on 3 Sundays, so that hidden ties or prior promises can be brought to light. The bell carries the news from nave to hedgerow. 3 times the names will ring, first as rumor, then as warning, finally as certainty. If anyone knows a reason why union should not happen, they are meant to step forward and let the world hear. The floor smells of damp stone and beeswax. The choir stalls creak like old boats. Consent, though quiet, is the core. Consensus, facet nuptias. Consent makes the marriage. 2 voices, willing and present, create the bond that no feast, no dowry, no lineage chart can replace. Yet voices can be pressured. Silence can be mistaken for assent. A father's shadow might fall across a daughter's face like a drawn curtain. The priest listens. The community watches. Somewhere, doves scuffle in the rafters, and the bride's pulse drums at her wrists. Among nobles, bloodlines are iron rails. A duke who marries unwisely weakens a border. A countess who weds without dispensation risks the legitimacy of heirs. Heralds stitch beasts on banners as if stitching families onto history. The great hall smells of pine resin and roasted meat. Scribes bend over vellum, weighing marriages as commanders weigh bridges. Names become armor. Anointed hands turn kinship into strategy. Alliances, dowers, the custody of castles whose walls sweat in winter and sparkle with frost. Among peasants, blood is measured more simply yet with equal gravity. Marry too close, and the village whispers. Marry wisely, and the fields answer with grain. A cousin who shares your well may not share your bed. The priest's book, thin, patched, precious, records baptisms, betrothals, deaths. On the spine, Grease darkens the leather where hands have prayed it open. The smell of tallow and singed wool hangs in the sacristy, and outside, a cartwheel ticks softly as it cools. Legitimacy determines inheritance, and inheritance determines survival. A child born to a union the church disallows can be left without rightful claim. Land slides to another branch, leaving one household rich in sons and poor in soil. To mend such knots, powerful families petition for papal dispensations, a sealed mercy that says blood may bend this once. Somewhere in a distant chancery, a clerk warms his hands over charcoal and writes the words that will change a valley S fate. Wax softens, a seal descends, a lineage breathes again. Clandestine marriages still bloom like night flowers in hedgerows and barns. Two hands join, two voices vow, and no one else hears. The theology is fragile and exacting. Consent is enough, yet the church yearns for witness and form. Later, when disputes arise, memory becomes a battlefield. Did she speak the words freely? Did he? A comb of horn, a ribbon, a knife traded across palms may be summoned as proof. The room holds the sour, sweet scent of ale and the dust of threshing. A candle drowns quietly in its own tears. The posting of bans is performance as much as law. On market mornings you can taste onion and cider on the air as neighbors gather to read the names. They murmur like bees. Is he free of other promises? Did her mother once swear another match? Somewhere a goose complains. Somewhere else a boy blows into numb fingers and dreams of a wedding loaf. Between gossip and conscience, obstacles rise and fall like winter fog. Blessings crown the boundaries. The priest lifts his hand, and the sign of the cross settles over two people the way a shawl settles over shoulders. Warm, a little scratchy, unquestionably real. He invokes saints who loved and suffered, angels who guard thresholds, the Virgin who carried both sorrow and life. The Latin rolls like a river through the nave. Incense threads the cold, and for a moment lineage and law turn translucent, lit from behind by mystery. Yet there is always the arithmetic of bodies to accompany the arithmetic of names. Some unions are made late, some early, some across distance, some across rank. When age or war or illness twists the chart, families recalculate. A widow remarried to protect a field, a younger sister given in place of one who died before the day. Life writes amendments that law can only chase. You hear the creak of a chest lid closing on linens heavy with lavender. You feel the rough nap of wool against chapped knuckles. Not every blessing holds. Rumor may cough up a forgotten promise. A witness may remember too clearly. The bonds delay a union until the snow melts. A dispensation is denied, and two hearts are told to back away. In these pauses, villages breathe out and in, uncertain. The wind combs the thatch. Dogs turn twice and settle. Under the altar, new mice learn the taste of wax. When finally the obstacles thin and the road clarifies, preparations sharpen into sound and scent. Flour thumps into a bowl, yeast wakes, a bride's gown is let out or taken in, a groom's belt is polished with grease. The priest lays the register open, its cracked spine whispering. He wets the ink, and the black shines like a crow's wing. What was once bloodline alone is now also blessing, a line drawn not only through ancestry, but through grace. As evening descends, the churchyard gathers blue shadows. Frost blooms along the graves like chalk flowers. Tomorrow the banns will be called again, one last time, and if no voice rises in protest, the path will lead inward, to the nave, to the vows, to the quiet thunder of two ordinary lives becoming a single weather. For now, the village listens to the faint bell and the soft gnaw of fire on wood and waits. Courtship, in the medieval sense, was not so much a fluttering of hearts as a choreography of duty. Yet beneath its weight, small sparks glimmered, glances stolen at market stalls, songs carried across stone courtyards, letters tucked into the folds of linen sleeves. In a world ruled by custom, affection survived in whispers. The church taught restraint, and the seasons conspired with it. Winter dimmed desires, spring coaxed them awake. At dusk, the air thickened with smoke from hearths and the faint scent of rosemary and sweat. Peasants, unlettered but watchful, knew the language of hands, how a palm lingered too long on a loaf of bread passed from one to another, how eyes met over a bucket drawn from the same well. In manor halls, courtship took a subtler shape. A nobleman's attention was declared through gifts, a length of imported silk, a clasp of pewter, a poem written by a hired clerk. A lady's acceptance might come as a favor, a ribbon tied to a sleeve before battle, a secret embroidered into the hem of a tunic. Beneath candles and tapestries, entire romances unfolded without a word. The age of chivalry turned this ritual into theater. Troubadours sang of unconsummated love, of nights devoted to unattainable ladies. Their verses filled the smoky air of feasts, drifting between the smell of roasted pheasant and spiced wine. The church frowned, but the songs endured. They gave nobility a language for longing, safe, poetic, and remote from sin. Meanwhile, in the villages below, the rhythm was simpler, rawer, closer to the earth. A boy might carve a comb for a girl, its teeth uneven but sincere. She might bake him a loaf, laced with caraway, or tie a sprig of herbs to his belt for luck. There was no parchment, no priest, only the slow testing of temperaments through work and weather. Evening gatherings at harvest time became the unspoken stage for pairing. Torches burned low, music scraped from fiddles and pipes. The fields smelled of straw, ale, and sweat. Young people danced until the stars blurred. Parents watched, half amused, half anxious. Each step was both freedom and risk, a display before the eyes of gossip, yet also one of the few moments when two people could exist outside the reach of law or lineage. The glow of candlelight carried secrets. In narrow alleys or behind barn doors, love met its peril. The church's commandments were strict: chastity before marriage, fidelity after. Yet flesh did not always obey. Parish records whisper of penances, barefoot processions, weeks of fasting, offerings of candles as long as a forearm. The air inside those churches smelled of beeswax and sin, forgiveness and smoke. Still, not all desire was condemned. Some priests, pragmatic men who saw more hunger than holiness, turned a blind eye to handfasting, informal unions sealed by clasped hands before witnesses. In poor parishes, such promises were as binding as rings. The words spoken were plain: I take thee. No Latin, no ceremony, only breath shared between two people who could not afford delay. Among the wealthy, love remained caged in formality. Letters written in careful script crossed long distances, carried by messengers through rain and mud, each word a coin of hope. Your favor sustains me as the sun sustains the vine, one might write. Pray remember me when the moon waxes. Sometimes the addressee never read them. Sometimes she did, and hid them in a psalter beside a pressed violet. In convent schools, young women learned not only prayers, but also the art of modest refusal. To seem too eager was dangerous. To seem cold was worse. Their teachers reminded them that Eve's curiosity had undone mankind, and so silence became both armor and language. A bowed head, a careful smile. These were the sentences they spoke, instead of love. Courting was a study in balance. A promise could bind too early. A rumor could ruin forever. The heart learned patience, and time became its ally. Lovers waited through Lent, through harvest, through winters when letters froze in saddlebags. They met under oak trees or in the cool echo of church porches. Their world was lit by candles, and candles burned slowly. When love was returned, it moved through the senses like soft rain, a thread of hair tied in secret, a look shared across a crowded hall, the brush of fingers when passing a jug. No poets recorded these moments, yet they outlasted many songs. In them lay the most human truth of the Middle Ages, that even in an age of obedience, affection found a way. Outside, night thickened over fields and towers. A hound barked, a bell tolled somewhere down the valley. In the hush that followed, you can almost hear the heartbeat of the past. Slow, uncertain, but alive. Tomorrow, the bands will sound again, and duty will reclaim its place. But tonight, the candle still burns low, and two hands reach across its light. Dawn arrives quietly, as if hesitant to disturb the moment. A thin mist floats over the meadows, softening the outlines of the church steeple and the low roofs beyond. Inside the bride's home, the fire has been burning since before first light. The air smells of damp wool, rye bread, and the faint sweetness of honey. Today is the day. The bride sits on a stool near the hearth while her mother and sisters braid her hair. Their fingers move quickly but tenderly, twisting the strands into long, patient ropes. A ribbon, dyed with crushed berries, winds through the plait. She wears linen beneath a wool gown, brown, maybe green. And if her family is fortunate, a thin girdle of leather or embroidered silk. Her shoes are stiff from the chill. No veil hides her face yet. That comes later when vows are spoken. In the next room, her father tightens his belt, pacing the floorboards that creak like ship timbers. He has paid the dowry and said the prayers. His expression is unreadable, part pride, part loss. He knows that by nightfall, the hearth will burn with one less shadow. Outside, a group of boys gathers with sticks and branches, laughing too loudly. It is tradition in some villages to wake the groom with noise, to drive away evil spirits, and to remind him, with mock cruelty, that his freedom ends today. He emerges half-dressed, grinning, his hands smelling of wood smoke and ale. Someone tosses a sprig of rosemary over his shoulder for luck. By mid-morning, the roads fill. Neighbors walk in clusters, women carrying baskets of bread, men clutching flasks of cider or wine. Children run ahead, their shoes slapping the frozen ground. Bells begin to toll. The sound rolls through the valley like the sea, steady and slow. It calls not only the living, but the memories of every wedding before, those whose names are lost, whose laughter still lingers in the soil. At the church door, the air is cool and smells of rain and stone. The priest waits in his vestments, his hands folded inside wide sleeves. 2 candles flicker on the altar, their flames bending as if listening. The groom stands to one side, his cloak newly brushed, his beard combed flat. When the bride appears, there is no gasp, no applause, only a collective silence, reverent and expectant. She walks slowly, her shoes whispering over the flagstones. The ceremony begins at the threshold, before the doors of the church, in the sight of all. This is deliberate. Marriage is a public act, a declaration before God and community. The priest as Latin drifts like a chant through the damp air. Ego conjungo vos in matrimonium. I join you in marriage. His voice echoes against the stone as the couple clasp right hands. A ring, if one exists, is made of iron or bronze. Gold is rare, a treasure reserved for nobles and saints. When it slips onto her finger, it is less a symbol of love than of permanence, a closed circle binding 2 lives together. The bride's veil is drawn, not white, but plain, a thin shield between her and the world. The kiss is brief and formal. The priest blesses them, tracing the sign of the cross in the air, and the congregation murmurs, Amen. Outside, the bells erupt again, faster this time, brighter, like wings unfurling. Then comes the walk to the feast. In noble halls, servants hurry ahead with torches. In villages, people carry baskets and laughter. The smell of roasting meat thickens the wind. Tables are laid with rough bread, salted fish, onions and cheese. If fortune smiles, there will be honey cakes and ale enough to forget the cold. The bride and groom sit at the center, two small figures surrounded by the hum of voices, the scrape of knives, the clatter of wooden cups. Custom dictates that the newlyweds must eat together from the same dish and drink from the same cup. It is a gesture older than memory. To share food is to share fate. The villagers cheer as the couple lifts the goblet, hands trembling, faces flushed. Somewhere, a minstrel begins to play. In wealthier houses, the rituals are elaborate. A minstrel sings of saints and lovers. A noble guest tosses coins for the poor. The steward pours wine thick as ink. Servants carry roasted boar's head, its tusks wrapped in ivy. Jesters tumble between benches. Children steal apples from platters. Laughter rises like smoke toward the rafters. Yet beneath it all, the ceremony continues in silence. The joining of households, the subtle shifting of property, the unseen negotiation of futures, the bedding ritual, half holy and half bawdy, comes after sunset. In some regions it is merely symbolic, a procession to the bridal chamber with candles and blessings. In others, it teeters between reverence and farce. Friends and kin escort the pair to their bed, singing songs half sacred, half obscene. They throw nuts and grain, symbols of fertility, and sometimes pull away the bride's shoes to ensure humility. When the curtains close, the laughter fades, replaced by the soft crackle of fire and the murmur of new vows whispered in private. Outside, the village keeps celebrating. Fires burn in the square, mead spills freely. Old stories are told again, of marriages that began in laughter and ended in legend, of brides who crossed mountains, of grooms who went to war and never returned. The moon climbs over the rooftops, turning everything silver. The smell of smoke and ale clings to the night. For the bride and groom, the world has changed. In the space of a few hours, two separate lives have folded into one. The future stretches ahead, uncertain but shared. Tomorrow, there will be work to do, fields to tend, debts to settle, meals to prepare. But for now, the night is theirs. The hearth glows softly in the darkness. The air inside the cottage is heavy with warmth, beeswax and breath. Outside, the last bells echo across the hills, each note a benediction fading into silence. Marriage, in this moment, feels both eternal and fragile, a single candle burning in an endless night. The wedding feast was the pulse of the Middle Ages, where ceremony gave way to celebration, and faith loosened its collar for a night. Once the vows were sealed and the blessings murmured, the village came alive like a body waking from prayer. Tables creaked beneath the weight of bread, cheese, and salted meat. Cups clinked, candles sputtered, and laughter rang out loud enough to shake the rafters. The smells came first: roasted goose, basted with honey, thick stews of barley and leeks, the sharp tang of ale spilling onto rushes strewn across the floor. A pot of pottage bubbled near the hearth, filling the room with warmth and the faint scent of pepper and smoke. Children darted between benches, their fingers sticky with honey. The air was dense, sweet, and alive. To feast was not merely to eat. It was to honor the union, to invite abundance, to keep hunger and misfortune at bay. The bread baked for the occasion was blessed with salt to drive away envy, and the crust was sometimes broken over the bride's head, a strange blend of humor and superstition. Grain symbolized fertility, and the laughter that followed was believed to please the saints and spirits alike. At noble weddings, the feast could last for days. Tapestries muffled the cold, while torches cast trembling light across gilded cups and silver platters. Musicians played viols and shawms, their melodies floating between the scent of wine and wax. Dancers moved in measured circles, sleeves fluttering like banners. Each bow, each step, was a ritual of grace, the echo of courtly love disguised as entertainment. Yet even in castles, decorum had limits. The line between reverence and revelry blurred as the night deepened. Jugglers appeared, jesters shouted verses too scandalous for daylight. A nobleman might slip away with a chambermaid. A lady might laugh too loudly at a bawdy rhyme. The servants who poured wine also stole kisses. In those hours between prayer and sleep, the world briefly forgot its hierarchies. In the villages, the rhythm was earthier, louder, and closer to joy. There were no silver cups, no velvet benches, only wooden tables, rough ale, and the heartbeat of drums. The fiddler's bow screeched, but nobody cared. Boots thudded on packed soil, skirts swirled, the night spun faster. Someone shouted a song about St. Agnes, or about love in the hayfields, and the crowd joined in. Voices cracked, laughter doubled over itself. The smell of sweat mingled with mead and the smoke of green wood. Sometimes the priest himself watched from the edge, smiling despite the church's caution against excess. He knew that celebration too was a kind of prayer, one that kept despair from taking root. For every rule written in Latin, there was another unwritten one that lived in the rhythm of the drum. Life is short, winter is long, and joy must be taken while it can. As the evening deepened, games began. Men tested strength with quarterstaves. Women raced with garlands in their hair. There were riddles, wagers, and tricks. Some villages performed mock rituals, the bridal chase, where the groom's friends pretended to steal the bride only to have her heroically rescued. Others paraded a straw figure through the streets, shouting blessings and nonsense in equal measure. It was chaos, but sacred chaos, the kind that renewed the world for another year. The bedding ceremony, if not done privately, might unfold again in laughter. Guests escorted the pair to their chamber, singing songs that mixed devotion with jest. The priest blessed the threshold, sprinkling holy water, while others threw nuts or coins. Someone might even place a child on the bed for luck, a symbol of future offspring. The couple's embarrassment was part of the charm, their blushes another sign that life would continue. In wealthier houses, musicians played until dawn. Candles dwindled to stubs. Wine turned sour in the cups. By then, the great hall smelled of tallow, spilled drink, and ash. Some slept where they sat, heads tilted back, mouths open in dreams. Others wandered outside to the cold air, where the first frost was forming on the grass. The stars above seemed clearer after so much noise, as if the heavens themselves had paused to listen. Even the poor found their moments of splendor. A simple loaf, shared between friends, was feast enough. A single jug of ale passed hand to hand beneath the moon. They danced on frozen soil, their laughter visible in clouds of breath. For one night, hunger was forgotten, and the future looked merciful. The newlyweds, wherever they were, could hear the echo of that joy drifting through the dark, a chorus of life promising that tomorrow they would not be alone. But feasts had their shadows. The church frowned upon drunkenness, warning that weddings could too easily become doorways to sin. Penances were sometimes assigned the next morning, a prayer, a candle offered, a vow renewed. Yet even the sternest confessor knew the truth, that in these brief, unruly hours, the community found its heartbeat. Without laughter, the solemn vows would wither. As the night waned, candles guttered in pools of wax. The fire sank into embers, glowing like eyes half asleep. Someone hummed a tune, a lullaby, or maybe a memory of one. The last cup was drained, the last loaf broken. Outside, dawn pressed its gray hand against the window panes. In that fragile silence after the storm of joy, you could hear the small sounds that define a new life beginning. A bride's sigh, a groom's breath, the faint shuffle of feet as guests departed into the pale morning. The feasting, the dancing, the disorder, all of it was the human side of faith, a way of saying to the darkness, we are here, we are alive, and we will keep loving in the light of another day. Morning comes softly, and the echo of laughter fades into the steady rhythm of ordinary life. The feast is over, the candles have melted to stubs, and the sweet smell of ale has turned sour in the air. The newly married couple wakes to a quieter world, one filled not with ceremony, but with duty. A sparrow taps against the shutter. Somewhere beyond the village green, a church bell tolls for prime, calling souls back from dream to labor. The house they share feels smaller now that it holds two lives. In the half-light, the hearth still smolders. The air tastes faintly of ash and bread. The bed is rough wool, its scent of smoke and straw lingering on their clothes. The bride, now wife, sits up first. Her hair smells of wood smoke and rosemary. She ties it back, wraps her shawl around her shoulders, and kneels by the hearth to coax the fire awake. Her husband stirs beside her, the weight of marriage settling into his limbs like morning frost. Medieval marriage was not a fairy tale. It was work, unending, cyclical, sacred work. Every day the same pattern repeated: the fetching of water, the kneading of dough, the mending of nets, the prayer before meals. For peasants, the rhythm of life was tied to the fields. They woke with the sun, their hands chapped by cold water, their backs bent before the first bird finished its song. A good marriage meant shared labor. She milked while he plowed. She spun while he mended tools. Each task overlapped like woven threads, binding the days together. In noble households, the pattern was gilded, but no less rigid. A lady might oversee servants, count loaves in the pantry, or keep tally of wine casks. Her husband dealt with rents, petitions, and border disputes. Their union was often political, yet even there, affection found its quiet places. An exchanged look during Mass, a shared jest during the long evening meal. In a world so governed by formality, these small human moments mattered most. Faith shaped every hour. The church watched the household as carefully as the parish watched its fields. Marriage was seen as a mirror of divine order. Husband as Christ, wife as the church, both bound in mutual obedience and endurance. The priest's sermons spoke of patience, of fidelity, of the sin of idle tongues. But beyond doctrine, the villagers knew a simpler truth. Marriage endured when two people could survive the winters together. Food was the pulse of that survival. The hearth became the center of their world, glowing in every season. Bread baked in its ashes, broth simmered in its heat. When storms battered the thatch or illness thinned the household, that fire was their small piece of eternity. Around it, stories were told, prayers whispered, disputes softened. A marriage's health could often be measured by the warmth of its hearth. Children followed, as they almost always did. The first cries filled the small house with equal joy and fear. Infant mortality was high. Many names were given, only to be spoken at gravesides. Yet every birth was an act of hope. Mothers tied small charms to cradles, bits of ribbon, saint medals, or carved wooden crosses. Fathers marked doorframes with chalk and whispered blessings in the dim hours before dawn. For the wife, motherhood meant endless labor, laundry, milking, weaving, childbirth, prayer, all without complaint, or at least without audience. Her hands became calloused, her eyes weary. But in the evenings, when the children slept, and her husband returned from the fields, there might be laughter, quiet, brief, but real. A jest about a neighbor's stubborn ox, a touch on the shoulder before bed. These were the small luxuries of affection that made survival bearable. Marriage in the Middle Ages balanced tenderness and tyranny. A husband was legally master of his household. A wife was bound to obedience. Yet within that framework, power shifted in subtle ways. A wise woman could guide a family's fortune as deftly as any lord guided his lands. Her counsel might shape the planting of fields or the settling of disputes. In many homes, love revealed itself not in words, but in trust, in shared bread, in a nod across a crowded market, in the rhythm of two people moving through the same day. The seasons turned, marking their union in invisible rings: spring's mud, summer's dust, autumn's smoke, winter's silence. Their clothes wore thin, their hair silvered, their children grew tall, and still the cycle of work and worship continued. Sunday Mass was the heartbeat of their week. They stood side by side in the cold nave, breathing in incense and candle wax, listening to the priest remind them of duty and death and grace. Sometimes there were quarrels, sharp words over bread gone stale, or jealousy born of exhaustion. The church urged forgiveness, though penance was often uneven. A man might confess anger and be given a prayer. A woman might confess anger and be told to serve. Yet even so, many couples grew old together in a kind of quiet companionship that neither sermon nor law could name. At night, when the fire burned low and the world was still, they spoke softly of their children, of the harvest, of the weather. Outside, frost gleamed on the thatch like starlight. Inside, two hands found each other beneath a coarse blanket. No minstrel would ever sing of them, no parchment would record their names, but theirs was the truest shape of marriage in the Middle Ages, the slow endurance of love in a fragile world. Sometimes, years later, when illness crept close or famine thinned the village, the memory of that first day, the bells, the feast, the laughter, returned like the scent of summer in the dead of winter. They would remember the candlelight and the vows and the way the world seemed to hold its breath as they said, Amen. It wasn't romance as we imagine it now. It was survival made sacred, and yet, beneath the layers of duty and prayer, the same quiet heartbeat endured, the sound of two lives breathing in unison, carrying the world forward, one sunrise at a time. Not every union thrived beneath the shadow of the church bells. For every couple that grew old together, there were others who bent beneath the strain of famine, of rumor, of temptation, of silence. The vows spoken in joy were tested not by sudden storms, but by the slow erosion of time. In the quiet corners of medieval life, where sin and duty blurred, marriage became both refuge and battlefield. Winter was often the first trial. Food stores dwindled, tempers shortened, and the endless dark pressed against the shutters. A husband out in the fields, too long, might come home cold and wordless. A wife too burdened might pray for dawn and dread it all the same. Poverty, more than passion, tore many households apart. The church might preach patience, but hunger has no piety. A loaf that could not be stretched, a debt unpaid, a child crying in the night. These were the true adversaries of marriage. There were other trials, subtler, but more dangerous. Gossip was a living thing in every village, carried like smoke through rafters. A glance misread, a laugh overheard, could become a scandal by morning. If a man lingered too long by another's door, tongues wagged. If a woman smiled too freely at market, her virtue was questioned. The line between friendliness and sin was thin as thread, and rumor had the power to unravel reputations built over years. A single story whispered in the wrong ear could summon the priest, or worse, the court. Infidelity, though condemned, was not unknown. The church declared that adultery imperiled the soul and the household alike, yet temptation was as human then as now. In noble courts, where marriages were made for politics, affection often strayed toward minstrels, squires, or ladies in waiting. Songs were written in secret codes, letters sealed with wax and tears. In the villages, it was simpler and crueler. A hasty sin behind the barn, a confession before Lent, a bruise of guilt that lingered longer than pleasure. Some priests demanded public penance, bare feet across frozen ground, prayers chanted beneath watching eyes. But others merely sighed, for they knew the world was frail. Violence, too, crept through the cracks. The church urged husbands to love their wives as Christ loved his church. But scripture was often read more as permission than warning. A wife's obedience was law, her suffering a private matter. Some parishes intervened, some turned away. In cities, records tell of women seeking sanctuary in churches, clinging to altars as bells rang for protection. Yet even there, forgiveness was demanded more often than justice. The world was still centuries away from the notion that kindness could be a right. Annulment was the church's only true escape from marriage, and it was a privilege of the wealthy. For peasants, there was no leaving, only endurance. But among nobles, petitions were sent to bishops and popes, claiming non-consummation, consanguinity, or coercion. The paperwork was labyrinthine, the verdict uncertain. A dispensation could erase years of shared life, scattering households like ash. Still, some tried. A loveless union could feel longer than a life sentence. Others sought solace in superstition. Love potions brewed from herbs and whispered charms, fertility rites performed under full moons, talismans sewn into bed linens. These quiet acts, half pagan and half prayer, spoke of desperation, an attempt to bend fate where faith had failed. The church called such things sinful, yet even priests found rosemary hanging above their beds. Hope, after all, is difficult to exercise. Witchcraft, or the fear of it, often shadowed troubled marriages. If crops failed or infants sickened, suspicion fell on the wife, especially if she was outspoken or skilled in herbs. Some were accused of enchanting their husbands, of dulling their strength or stirring their wrath. In truth, they were guilty only of existing within a world too small for mystery. The flames that once warmed their hearth could, in darker times, turn to judgment. Still, amid trials, reconciliation found its ways. Confession was a sacred bridge. Husbands knelt beside wives as the priest murmured absolution. Tears fell into dust, and for a time, peace returned. Holy days offered renewal, a shared candle on Easter, a kiss of peace at Christmas Mass. The church believed that forgiveness restored not just the soul, but the home, and sometimes it did. When plague swept through towns, testing every bond, those who endured found their love reforged. The sight of one's spouse surviving another winter, another funeral, became a quiet miracle. They learned to hold hands again in silence, to pray for mercy not only for the dying, but for each other. Even when the world burned, marriage remained a small sanctuary, fragile but lit from within. Yet the trials left marks. Behind every weathered face was a history of patience and pain. The lines around the eyes, the slowness of laughter, the way a hand hesitated before touch, these were the scriptures written on flesh. Some marriages grew stronger from hardship, others turned to habit, like the steady drip of rain from a cracked roof. The church would call both holy, and when endurance finally ran out, there was the quiet separation of spirit long before death. A wife who turned inward to prayer, a husband who spent his evenings at the alehouse. They still shared a roof, still exchanged greetings, still warmed themselves by the same fire, but their souls had drifted like smoke through the rafters. No court recorded such divorces of the heart. Only neighbors noticed, and perhaps the children. Yet even then, grace lingered. There were mornings when the light fell kindly on familiar faces, when laughter slipped back into the room as if nothing had been broken. A hand extended in silence, a shared meal, a smile that forgave more than words could. Marriage was a long pilgrimage through the landscape of human frailty, and every trial was another mile toward understanding what it meant to love in a world that promised suffering. When the bell rang again for Sunday Mass, the same faces gathered beneath its sound, weary, flawed, but present. The priest spoke of covenant and redemption, of the sanctity of vows, of the patience of saints. In the pews, wives whispered prayers not of passion, but of endurance. Husbands traced crosses on rough palms, and for a few brief moments, as incense rose and the choir sang, the weight of their trials lifted like mist. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the bell across the fields, through windows, over sleeping children. It rang for sinners and saints alike, for the faithless and the faithful, for those who still believed that love, even battered, even weary, could endure until the end. Widowhood and second chances. The years pass quietly, like pages turning in a book no one reads aloud. The couple who once stood beneath the church bells now move more slowly through their days. The fields that were once green with promise are gray with stubble. The hearth that once roared with laughter now burns low. And then, one morning, the bed is half empty. Death in the Middle Ages was not a stranger, it was a neighbor. It came in fevers, in wars, in childbirth, in silence. Few marriages ended in peace. Fewer still ended together. Widowhood was not an exception, but a chapter most expected to read before their own story closed. When a husband died, the world did not stop, but it changed in ways that only the widow could feel. The house, though still full of noise, suddenly echoed. Every tool, every garment, every cup on the shelf seemed to remember his touch. His cloak hung beside the door, faintly smelling of earth and rain. The priest came first, a blessing, a prayer, a handful of holy water flicked onto the air like dew. Then came the neighbors, their faces drawn, their sympathy offered in bread and silence. The church taught that marriage ended at death, that the bond was sacred but not eternal. Until death do you part was a promise fulfilled. And yet, for many, love persisted like smoke in rafters, clinging to everything it once warmed. The widow wore black, not as ornament, but as armor, to warn the world that her joy was buried, but her heart still lived. The law turned quickly to its own rituals. A woman's dowry might be reclaimed, her inheritance debated. If she bore sons, they became her fragile shield. If she had none, her security wavered like a candle in the wind. In manors and courts, clerks argued over land and lineage, while in villages, the dispute was simpler. Who would plow her fields? Who would feed her in winter? Charity, even pity, could be fickle things. For noble widows, freedom came draped in caution. They might manage estates, receive guests, and even influence politics, but all beneath the watchful eyes of the church and kin. Many were pressured to remarry quickly. Alliances waited to be reforged, fortunes to be secured, but some refused. They took the veil, entering convents where peace and prayer replaced the noise of command. Behind cloister walls, they became patrons of scriptoria, donors to hospitals, keepers of memory. Among peasants, the choices were fewer. A widow might remarry out of need, often within months. Life demanded it, the land demanded it. A pair of hands alone could not harvest grain, nor mend fences, nor defend a cottage from hunger. Marriage, in this sense, became less about love and more about survival's arithmetic. Yet even then, affection sometimes bloomed again, awkwardly, hesitantly, like spring flowers pushing through frost. For widowers, the rhythm was different, but equally lonely. Without a wife, the hearth lost its order. Meals went cold, children grew wild, shirts went unpatched. The church encouraged remarriage, especially if children were young. A home without a mother was seen as incomplete, even dangerous to the soul, and so many men sought new wives, often younger, sometimes poorer, each bringing her own shadow of the past into the house. Second marriages were both new beginnings and haunted repetitions. The wedding bells rang again, but softer, more cautious. The village attended, but with knowing eyes. The priest's blessing was the same, though his tone carried the weight of memory. The bride might wear color, but the groom's eyes often drifted toward absence, toward someone no longer there. Step families formed like grafted trees. Children from one marriage mingled with those of another, their loyalties tangled. The church warned against jealousy and urged fairness, but human hearts do not obey sermons easily. There were quarrels, reconciliations, silent feasts where no one spoke. Yet, sometimes, the house filled with laughter again, smaller, gentler, hard-won. In old age, widowhood returned for nearly everyone. Life expectancy was short, but grief was long. Widows gathered at churchyards, their veils fluttering like crows' wings. They shared bread and stories, remembering their husbands not as saints or sinners, but as men, stubborn, kind, weary, sometimes cruel, always human. Memory softened the sharp edges. The quarrels faded. The small mercies remained. Some widows found solace in faith. The Virgin Mary was their quiet companion, a figure who understood loss, labor, and endurance. Candles burned before her image, prayers whispered for both the living and the dead. The smell of wax, of smoke, of wet stone, all became the language of remembrance. Others turned to superstition. They tied ribbons to trees for luck, sprinkled salt on thresholds to keep loneliness away, or placed a husband's belt beneath the bed to dream of him. The church frowned, but the heart obeyed older gods in grief. As years passed, the second chances of love appeared less as defiance and more as grace. The village watched without judgment. Even priests learned to bless unions made not from ambition, but from shared sorrow. A widower and a widow, both worn by time, walking side by side through the market. It was not romance as youth imagined it, but a quiet companionship built from the knowledge that everything can be lost, and still life continues. When such couples married, their ceremonies were small. No feasts, no dances, no games, just hands clasped before the altar, eyes lowered, vows spoken softly. Around them, candles flickered like memory itself. Each flame a life lived, each spark a promise that even after loss, the soul could find warmth again. And so, widowhood became not an ending, but a mirror. It reflected what love had endured and what might still be possible. To live through loss was to understand devotion in its truest form, not as passion or duty, but as faith that refuses to die. At dusk, in churchyards across Europe, widows lingered among the stones. They touched the carved names, traced the dates worn by rain. The bell tolled for vespers, deep and slow. Some wept, some smiled. Then they turned toward home, toward firelight, toward another meal, toward whatever days remained. The past walked beside them, but so did hope. The world, for all its cruelty, still offered second chances. And somewhere in the darkness, 2 candles burned, one for the life that was, and one for the life still to come. Love. Beyond time, night settles over the old village once more, and the sound of the bells fades into the mist. The streets are empty now, save for a stray dog and the whisper of the wind through winter branches. Somewhere behind shuttered windows, a candle flickers, the last one burning before sleep. It might be the same kind of candle that lit the faces of brides and grooms centuries ago. The same soft flame that watched them kneel, vow, and age together. Time has carried away the names, the laughter, the tears. Yet the essence of those marriages, their quiet endurance, their warmth against the cold, lingers like breath on glass. What was once the world of dowries, feasts, and blessings has become dust, but the emotions remain untouched. Love, fear, duty, and faith. These have no century. Imagine standing again beneath the bell tower. The stones are cracked, moss-covered, but still upright. The same wind passes through, carrying echoes of vows spoken in Latin, whispered promises made in haste, and the faint rhythm of a long-vanished song. You can almost see them, the brides with lowered eyes, the grooms with trembling hands, the priest lifting his hand in benediction. Their world is gone, but its heartbeat remains steady as ever. For medieval people, Marriage was a shelter built from the materials of their time, faith instead of law, obedience instead of choice, endurance instead of comfort. Yet, within that narrow frame, they found tenderness. They learned to love through routine, to mend, to feed, to pray, to forgive. Love did not roar, it whispered. It survived in the clatter of pots, the smell of bread baking, the sound of two voices murmuring prayers beside the same bed. It's easy to think of them as distant, strangers in rough wool and coarse manners. But listen closely, and you'll hear something familiar. The same hesitation before a wedding, the same ache of loss, the same laughter that follows a quarrel. Across centuries, humanity has not changed so much. We still seek warmth in another soul. We still try to build permanence from the fragile materials of time. Those who married for duty sometimes found love in the doing, and those who married for love learned that duty was love in disguise. The church told them their vows were holy, and perhaps that was true. But holiness often came not from ceremony, but from the long patience of two people keeping faith with one another. Picture them now, in every walk of life, the peasant woman lighting her fire at dawn, humming softly to herself as her husband shoulders the plow, the noble lady reading by candlelight, her husband asleep beside her, their fingers brushing in the dark, the widow walking alone to church, her veil fluttering in the wind, the young man carving a ring from bone because metal was too costly, yet the gesture too meaningful to skip. Their gestures, their prayers, their weariness, all of it was love made visible. They didn't need to name it. They simply lived it through hardship and joy alike. In that world, love was often unspoken, but always seen, in the tending of a wound, in the saving of a crust of bread, in the simple act of staying when leaving would have been easier. That was the miracle, not the feast, not the vow, but the daily endurance of care. And when death finally came, love did not vanish. It clung to shawls, to rosaries, to the sound of a name whispered one last time. The living carried it forward, into prayers, into songs, into second chances. Even now, centuries later, that love lives on in us, reshaped but recognizable. When we speak vows today, when we light candles, share rings, or whisper promises in the dark, we are repeating an ancient story, a story told by farmers and queens, by orphans and abbesses, by men who went to war and by women who waited. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not perfect, but it was real, deeply, painfully, beautifully real. The world outside thatched roofs has changed. The bells are electric now, the rings are gold, the vows are our own. But beneath it all, the same current hums, the same yearning for connection, the same fragile faith that two hearts, together, can stand against the cold. The past, in this way, never fully ends. It lingers in our gestures, in our words, in the quiet moments between breaths. Somewhere, in every act of love, the Middle Ages still flicker like candlelight through stained glass. So, as the night deepens, let the story rest. The bells have stopped, the hearth has cooled, the old couples have long since gone to sleep, but their warmth remains, folded gently into history. It glows in every kindness we inherit, every promise we keep, every life built, not from perfection, but from patience. If you've drifted this far with me, through the feasts and vows, the laughter and the loss, take a moment to breathe. Feel the weight of the centuries fall away. The candle still burns, quietly, faithfully, in the window of the past. If you enjoyed drifting through this piece of history, maybe leave a like, or simply let the story carry you into sleep. If you'd like to hear more quiet journeys like this one, you can subscribe, but only if it feels right. The night is long, and the world remembers you.